Sorry, yeah, okay, I've just been told recording is in progress, so I shall click on continue. Thank you, Barbara, for giving us the opportunity to be part of this day and this group of sessions. And yes, I've been involved with Christians Aware for quite a time, and I just so enjoy being part of your gatherings. And as I was saying, much rather be in possible hall physically with everybody, but Zoom will have to do. As Barbara said, we're doing a double act this afternoon, and I'm delighted to be able to share the platform, metaphorically speaking, with Anne-Marie. She's been with Christian Aid since towards the end of last year, which means that although we've had a lot of contact on Zoom and Teams and so on, we've never actually met either. So one hopes that that'll happen one day quite soon. But in the meantime, the double act is about to start. I should also flag that we took the liberty of changing the title. I think the aim of the session is going to be the same as Barbara instructed us, but we, as you will see, we've changed the title to something that felt slightly less terrifying, but I hope will still be as challenging as we intend. So I'll hand over to Anne-Marie for the first part, and then see how we get on. But thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's so nice to be here. I'm really excited to be joining Jenny for this double act. And I hope that you find this really informative and moving. And our desire is really that it stirs your spirits into action, and that this will be a space for us to encourage one another towards the direction that we want to see transformation in. So I'm just going to check that I've got all my tech set up fine. I think it looks okay. Jenny, give me a shout if anything doesn't quite happen. So my role at Christian Aid is Poverty and Inequality Advisor, and I'll be talking you through some of the ideas that we try and bring to life in Christian Aid, but also some things that we can be thinking about specifically as Christians, how we can be praying and acting to be able to bring about transformational change. So just to give you a quick roadmap of what we'll be doing, I'll be introducing us with just an overview of the concepts of poverty and inequality, so that we are on the same page of understanding of what we mean when we say poverty and what we mean when we say inequality as well. And then we're going to consider these two ideas within our current context in the pandemic, and think about where we are seeing inequality. And then Jenny, actually before that, I'm going to then introduce climate injustice, which actually is, we believe, a much more long-term issue that we need to be focusing our attention to and giving effort towards. And then Jenny is going to talk specifically about what's happening with climate injustice. And also she'll be giving you some ideas of how you can get involved in bringing about transformational change. And then towards the end, we're going to go into breakout rooms to have a quick discussion so that we can learn from one another. As colleagues from Christian Aid within the organization, we're really passionate about shared learning. And so we want to be able to create a space where you're able to learn from each other and be able to be encouraged by one another. So I hope that you enjoy that. So we had the privilege of being introduced to these ideas of harmony and where we encountered disharmony within our world. And I feel that that really sets us up so well for the rest of the day today. And within the context of poverty and inequality, certainly for us as Christian Aid and many other international non-governmental organizations, as well as faith-based organizations, our focus is really in restoring that harmony by tackling poverty and inequality, which manifest the disharmony that was introduced earlier. So when we talk about poverty, what is it that we're actually saying? So often we think about poverty in terms of money and finance and income. But I want us to start by understanding that poverty is the evidence of a collective failure by society to protect its most vulnerable members. That actually the experience of poverty is not because individuals have done something wrong, but that these systems that we're a part of in our world, they are creating the environment for people to be experiencing and living in poverty. We understand poverty as multidimensional. So this means it's not simply measured or expressed through financial metrics or indices, but that it's expressed through a lack of resources to healthcare, education, safe housing and shelter, but also access to rights as well. So we recognize that these different intersecting inequalities all contribute towards the experience of poverty. When we specifically talk about people living in extreme poverty, these are the people who are experiencing these multi-dimensional expressions at heightened extents, all at the same time. So when you're considered as a person living in poverty in a multidimensional expression, you may have a lack of healthcare access, perhaps your education hasn't quite completed fully, and also you're not able to express your rights, you're not able to go and participate in voting, for example. So the people who are living in situations like that are the ones who would say are living in extreme poverty. In addition to this, so what we've just talked about, we can identify this in individual and perhaps community level. But beyond this, we also recognize poverty as a political expression as well. And what I mean by this is that it's reinforced through ideas and choices that create inequality. And of course, inequality then exacerbates poverty. So we recognize that these choices that are keeping people living in poverty can be changed and can be influenced. And this is what Jenny's going to talk about and offer you an invitation into joining us into how these choices can be influenced and changed. And just on the next section on inequality, I'll talk specifically about vaccine inequality, which of course is such a timely situation to be wrestling with and to be grappling with. So for us as Christian Aid specifically, we share a desire that focuses on celebrating people as they flourish out of poverty, because we recognize that their sense of belonging, joy, and hope and fulfillment collectively contributes to the reality of a restored world that we want to see. So when we talk about the restored world, that's that sense of harmony that we've been talking about already. So when we go on to inequality, inequality can be seen in various ways, ranging from a denial of individual and collective opportunities, as well as outcomes. And it also includes the structural forms of inequality within the social condition that we live in. So I've separated inequality into two different streams. Number one, inequality of opportunities. So you could identify this as, say, people not being able to take up employment because there's a lack of jobs in a country or in a region, lack of education and healthcare services. But then inequality also manifests itself through inequality of outcomes. And this happens when people have equal amounts of opportunities, but the outcomes of what happens from those opportunities are still different when you look at particular demographics. So when we recognize these two differences, we understand that there are structural issues that are present everywhere, both in the UK and around the globe as well. And I think that this, recognizing this at this point is important because it shows us that we need a global effort to tackle inequality, because poverty and inequality are not just issues out there in the rest of the world, that these are dynamic issues that are coming into our spaces in and out. And of course, as Christians, we believe that we are, part of the body of Christ. And so issues that are happening out there that are affecting people are of concern to us, especially when they are promoting disharmony. So when we look specifically at inequality, a way that we can identify that in the UK right now is within the pandemic. We see that Black and minority ethnic groups, ethnic minority communities have been disproportionately affected by the COVID-19 virus. We also see that people who are living in particularly vulnerable socioeconomically challenged areas geographically across the UK have also been disproportionately affected by the virus. And so we have to question and think about the things that are happening there. If we have equality in opportunities to get the vaccine, to get healthcare, what is happening that is resulting in unequal outcomes for these particular groups? And those are the things that we want to be able to interrogate further together. So when we think about the vaccine gap specifically around the world, less than 1% of the billion doses that have been administered have gone to economically vulnerable countries. And more than 83% have gone to economically resilient countries. So this is not quite taken into account those middle income countries, is what we'd call them. So 83% have gone to economically resilient countries. And for those of us who are based in the UK, that includes us. And so what we can see from this picture is that wealthier countries, we here in the UK and other countries, are hoarding vaccines and protecting the needs of pharmaceutical companies for financial gain, which is inherently corrupt in itself. Because as we said, poverty is the evidence of a collective failure. And so this is an example of where we are collectively failing to take care of the most vulnerable in our global community. So the World Health Organization have affirmed that we need 11 billion doses to be in a good place to overcome the virus globally. But recently, the G7 actually only committed to 1 billion doses collectively. So when you compare how much they've committed to with the amount of wealth that they have, there's a significant imbalance. And so we'll be talking a little bit more about what this looks like in terms of climate injustice. But a way in which Christian Aid are trying to challenge these different imbalances of power is by being part of the People's Vaccine Alliance. And we've put the website up on your screens there, which you can look into. And what we're trying to do is make sure that we are lobbying the power holders across the globe to make sure that there is priority for a people's vaccine. And so I'd encourage you to have a look at that website to see what else you may be interested in getting involved in with that. But when we think about vaccine inequality, the specific things that need to happen to change this is that we need an increased production capacity. We need the patent for the virus, for the vaccines to be waived. And also wealthier countries need to be more willing to share knowledge and technology to help countries that are in more economically vulnerable situations. We also need to encourage broader distribution around the world to make sure that the very least, the people who are suffering the most and are having to wrestle with lots of different dimensions of poverty are being taken care of first. Now, this is really, really difficult message to have to have to communicate to, you know, power holders. But of course, as people who care deeply about the message of the gospel, this is an embodiment of that we make sure that we're taking care of people within our global community who are vulnerable, and knowing that this is what God does for us as well in our place of need too. So an example that we want to highlight, just to share how Christian Aid have been supporting work to try and to support work that communities are taking part in to tackle the virus. We pick out an example from Nepal. So this is a picture of a radio journalist in Nepal, and Christian Aid have been supporting different programs to help disseminate information, raising awareness about the risks of the virus, how you can go about preventing transmission of the virus as well. So our support is context specific, and we try and engage communities to help them to understand what they can do within their circle of influence. So the messages that are covered over radio programs like this cover misconceptions about the virus, but also they address issues such as domestic violence, what to do in situations like that, which of course we know across the globe during the pandemic and during lockdowns, domestic violence within the home has increased significantly. The programs also cover information like how to distribute workload, which in itself, when you look at the household, when people are having to stay home, the trends that we've seen is that women are having to take up significantly more of the jobs within the house, but also childcare, as well as juggling a job as well. And also it includes information about how to take care of vulnerable family members or vulnerable members within the community, as well as marginalized groups as well. So specific, context-specific examples like this are just a little snapshot of how Christian Aid are trying to support communities in a way that's suitable for them to try and alleviate the damaging effects of the virus. But of course, the virus is so to speak, moment in time. It doesn't feel like it because it feels like we've been here for such a long time. I definitely have been feeling like that. I know all of you have as well. But we actually want to focus your attention on climate injustice, which has been an issue for decades and decades and is increasingly becoming an issue for so many of us. And when we think about poverty and inequality, climate injustice is such a significant driver of both of those. So when we talk about climate injustice, what we mean is we're referring to the unfair distribution of benefits and damages related to climate change. And what we see in climate injustice is that there's an exploitation of members of our society who are already vulnerable, who are already living in poverty, and are already on the sharper end of inequality as well. And what we see happening within the narrative of climate justice or injustice is that those who have not participated in this fossil fueled capitalist world that we're living in actually end up facing the most significant damaging effects of what's happening right now. And we see this imbalance of power because people who are in the most vulnerable situations are not able to always vocalize their needs and challenge power holders to say, this pollution is not helping us. This pollution has damaging effects on our health and so on. So what we see is that the communities who are least responsible for climate change tend to be the most vulnerable to the harm that it produces, which is a heartbreaking reality to face up to. Now in Genesis 1, in the story of creation, we see God talking about dominion and the human race having dominion over the earth. And historically, this idea has been used as justification for us to live in a way that prioritizes our desires and pleasures over the collective needs of the earth. But dominion in the story of creation actually means to nurture and care for, not to dominate and exploit. But of course, what happens is when you combine capitalist economies, our individual desires for more, greed and pride, what happens is that we do create these cultures that dominate and exploit the environment at the cost of others. So our ability to do this, to nurture and care for the world well, is intrinsically linked to the well-being and flourishing of one another. So what would be great to hear from all of you is I have a short little interactive question. If you're able to have access to the chat, I want you to just throw in some quick ideas or answers to this question. In what ways have you seen or experienced climate injustice? Now, this could be in your immediate community, or it could be in broader context, perhaps that you've seen. We have been witnessing the damaging effects in Germany, and of course that for people in the UK, perhaps that feels closer and closer to the urgency that I think we've needed to have. So I just want, in the spirit of shared learning, if you could just throw some ideas in the chat of where you've seen or experienced climate injustice. Now, to talk very specifically about the ways in which we see climate injustice manifesting, I just want to pull out two examples. So number one is health, the effect of health in terms of driving this correlation up, as well as food shortages. So what we see in terms of health is that increasing variable rainfall patterns around the world are likely to significantly affect rainfall patterns in a negative way. And of course, what happens is a lack of safe water compromises hygiene and increases the risk of diseases that are transmitted through water. And a statistic that I found really just heartbreaking was 500,000 children under the age of 5 years old die every year to diarrhea and related diseases, which I think is just awful because they are preventable. And what happens as well when we see these increasing or unpredictable rain patterns is that floods contaminate freshwater supplies and increase that risk of waterborne diseases further as well. Now, as I gave the example before from Nepal, radio programs such as those can be ways in which communities are able to share information about how to prevent these illnesses. But of course, we have to strive for complete eradication of the risk to make sure that inequality is not an outcome for people at all. So it's not enough just to equip people with information. We want to make sure that the things that are causing damage are completely eradicated. And then just the final example on how climate change and poverty are related, we can witness that through food shortages. 3 out of 4 people who are living in poverty right now rely on agriculture and natural resources for their livelihood. And when we talk about rain patterns as well, the different variation of rain patterns actually undermine the production of food and increases the competition within communities for the remaining land that's able to produce food and a source of livelihood for people. And this increases the tensions within the community, which in itself is an additional expression of poverty, because then there's a sense of insecurity that people are having to live in. And Jenny actually has a really good example of a way in which community has found a solution around this. So Jenny, if you're happy to just share that.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I was in Kenya a while ago and visited one of Christiane's projects in a rural area that had been very badly hit by drought and by unpredictable rainfall. And the problem, one of many problems with unpredictable rainfall, is if you're trying to grow food for your family, then you have to guess when the rains will start and then when you can plant and harvest and so on. And if you're feeding your family, guesswork is no good at all. And so our partner, which was the part of the Anglican Church, came up with this brilliant idea of using basic mobile phones, which everybody had access to send reliable weather forecasts by text, reaching thousands of farmers, most of whom were women. And because they could then rely on the forecasts, they were able to plan their growing and harvesting and so on. And they ended up, most of them, with a surplus of food, which meant that they could sell that, buy a wider range of food. They could pay for education for the children, medicines, all the sort of things we take for granted. And it was just so easy and not an expensive project initiative at all, but really transforming and bringing something closer to harmony in a very, very climatically disharmonious environment. So I tend to enthuse about that one because it made a lot of impact. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Jenny. Just before we go on to this short video, which talks a little bit more about this much eloquently than we all could, I will just pick out some of the comments that have been shared in the chat. So Anthony had raised to add equity too. I agree completely. Very, very important, because of course equality and equity are different, and we need both for harmonious outcomes for people. And the addition on poverty has now become more structured, very much so. And Jenny's actually going to touch on some of the ways in which this is structurally embedded into our society when talking about some of the kind of more macro issues too. Flooding and fires as examples too. Yes, we're seeing that in, I believe, Australia and the US as well. That's been happening quite a bit. Mainstream media don't always report this. Yes, I agree. That in itself is inequality in action, because some people's lives, one could argue, matter more than others, and so certain issues get more coverage than others, which is very, very disheartening. So Anthony's given the example here in India, the aftermath of frequency disaster, and the second disaster, the COVID pandemic, has destroyed the livelihoods completely. And I'm sure everyone can agree that actually seeing what's been happening in India has been really, really, really disheartening. And we're believing for transformation to happen for the country there. So I will play this poem, and then Jenny will take over after it's done. If we can't hear the sound, someone just give me, Jenny, if you could let me know, but I think I've set it up okay, so let's try this.
Can we just flag that the poem is by Amanda Gorman, who did the amazing inaugural poem at President Biden's inauguration. So that's the connection.
Thank you, Jenny. Sorry, my my tech is being a bit temperamental. So much so I forgot to introduce who was doing the poem. Let's try it one more time.
On Christmas Eve, 1968, astronaut Bill Anders snapped a photo of the Earth as Apollo 8 orbited the moon. Those three guys were surprised to see from their eyes what a planet looked like an Earth-wise, a blue orb hovering over the moon's gray horizon with deep oceans and silver skies. It was our world's first glance at itself, our first chance to see a shared reality, a declared stance, and a commonality, a glimpse into our planet's mirror. And as threats drew nearer, our own urgency became clearer as we realized that we hold nothing dearer than this floating body we all call home. We've known that we're caught in the throes of climactic changes some say will just go away, while some simply pray to survive another day. For it is the obscure, the oppressed, the poor who, when the disaster is declared done, still suffer more than anyone. Climate change is the single greatest challenge of our time. Of this, you're certainly aware. It's saddening, but I cannot spare you from knowing an inconvenient fact, because it's getting the facts straight that gets us to act and not to wait. So I tell you this not to scare you, but to prepare you, to dare you to dream a different reality where, despite disparities, we all care to protect this world, this riddled blue marvel, this little true marvel, to master the verve and the nerve to see how we can serve our planet. You don't need to be a politician to make it your mission to conserve, to protect, to preserve that one and only home that is ours. To use your unique power to give next generations the planet they deserve. We are demonstrating, creating, advocating. We heed this inconvenient truth because we need to be anything but lenient with the future of our youth. And while this is a training in sustaining the future of our planet, there is no rehearsal. The time is now, because the reversal of harm and protection of a future so universal should be anything but controversial. So, Earth, pale blue dots, we will fail you not. Just as we chose to go to the moon, we know it's never too soon to choose hope. We choose to do more than cope with climate change. We choose to end it. We refuse to lose. We do this and more, not because it's very easy or nice, but because it is necessary. Because with every dawn, we carry the weight of the fates of this celestial body orbiting a star. And as heavy as that weight sounded, it doesn't hold us down, but it keeps us grounded, steady, ready, because an environmental movement of this size is simply another form of an earthrise. To see it, close your eyes, visualize that all of us in this room and outside of these walls or in these halls, all of us change makers, or in a spacecraft floating like a silver raft in space, and we see the face of a planet anew. We relish the view, we witness its round green and brilliant blue, which inspires us to ask deeply, wholly, what can we do? Open your eyes, know the future of this wise planet is right in sight, right in all of us. Trust this earth uprising, all of us bring light to exciting solutions never tried before, for it is our hope that implores us at our uncompromising core to keep rising up for an earth more than worth fighting for.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah. Well, that is a really hard act to follow. Absolutely stunning. Really giving us a sense of the urgency and the level of ambition, and just a really clear call to action. And I mean, in some ways, we could just sort of stop there and go and hide and reflect on those incredibly powerful words. But then Barbara would be annoyed with me because I wouldn't have done what we promised we would do. And well, what I'm going to spend the next few minutes doing is to talk a little bit about the COP in Glasgow, COP standing for Conference of the Parties in UN speak, the UN meeting of world leaders who are coming together in Glasgow in November. And this is the big opportunity, and close to the last really big opportunity for the world to come together and agree action, which is going to turn around the climate crisis turn around global heating? So there's a lot hanging on this. And then I'm going to talk about how each of us in our different ways and locations can get involved and do something to push the COP, the world leaders, actually to commit and then to act on their commitments. So that's how the next few minutes will go. And again, thinking about the poem, although she doesn't use, I don't think, the word harmony and disharmony, what she's spoken is all about disharmony and harmony. And so looking at the, we've talked about climate injustice, and I know this theme of justice, fairness is absolutely fundamental. It's the poorest people in the world, as Anne-Marie said, who are really being hammered by the climate crisis, even more than those of us in the richer countries where we have better coping systems and support systems to respond. And one statistic that I came across, the average person in the United Kingdom generates as much carbon dioxide as 212 Burundians. And yet we know those 212 Burundians are feeling the impacts far worse than anyone in the UK, even despite all the floods and unpredictable weather that we have been experiencing. So that's just one very local, specific example of how important this crisis is. And although, as Anne-Marie also said, the pandemic is a massive crisis, it's brought loss, trauma, grieving, just hideous stuff to millions and millions of people, billions around the world. It is a finite crisis in the way that the climate crisis is not, and the climate crisis impacts on everybody and every living thing in the world. So it's on an even greater scale, and it is the biggest crisis of our time. So we've got the COP, and all being well, world leaders will be meeting in person in Glasgow. And there are various things that Christian Aid and many, many other faith-based organisations, non-governmental organisations, many people around the country, around the world, are demanding are achieved at COP. And that's where the list on the screen comes in. There's mitigation. Mitigation is about reducing emissions so that the global heating stops and ideally over time turns round. And the big thing on that is fossil fuels. So stopping the use of coal and gas and oil, because those are the big generators of carbon emissions, going into renewable energy. So that's all the sort of the big thing around mitigation. And then there are adjustments to make to help people cope with the current impacts. So that's adaptation. That's where you get, for instance, the text messages with weather forecasts that I was talking about could be, and there are loads of examples, but could be in Nicaragua, growing coffee is more difficult because the climate is warming. And so shifting production to honey and to cocoa and which all cope better with the sort of climate that's developing there. And then there's this mysterious thing called loss and damage, which is sort of relatively new in the conversation, but that is very much about compensating communities for loss, damage, which cannot be dealt with by changing the way they do things or by reducing the mitigation, reducing carbon emissions, because it's all too late for that. So that might be the impact of natural disasters and how you help communities rebuild after that. That would be loss and damage. And then I think it's been mentioned in the chat, nature-based solutions are a really important part of the equation. And that could be things like changing the sort of crops that you're growing. It could be planting mangroves to help protect land from storm surges. And I've seen that, for instance, in Myanmar, but it happens so many places. And you could have somebody simply planting a tree to shade a house, or it could be looking at the Amazon basin and the role that that plays or has played while it's been able to play, creating rainfall and as a carbon sink. So all sorts of different ways in which nature really has to be part of the equation. Next slide, please. And because the COP was supposed to happen last year and obviously was not able to happen, a very enterprising group of young people from around the world, from about 140 countries, got together to set up mock COP, which, as it says on the slide, filled the 2020 gap. And this is just a brilliant initiative, nothing at all to do with Christian aid, but very much the sort of thing that we're keen to publicize. And so they got together online and came up with a declaration saying exactly what they thought world leaders should be doing. And now they're doing a lot of campaigning in their different countries, pushing their leaders to take all this seriously, take their messages on board, take them to the COP in Glasgow and change things. So it's not just I don't know, Christian aid and Christian aid supporters who are involved. The glory of the climate movement is that people from all ages, all parts of the world are together on this one. And mock COP is a really good example. Next slide, please. And then, as we're aware, the COP this year is hosted in the UK, and it's also chaired by the UK. And that puts the UK in a really, really key position, potentially very, very influential, both in setting the agenda in all the negotiations before people come together, and then at the COP itself, real potential for getting a good outcome. And this list is the sort of things that we and many other people are asking the government, Boris Johnson, to do. And it's first of all about increasing financial support to the poorest countries so that they can actually respond and cope better with the impacts of the climate crisis. It's about investing in a green recovery, so not going back to coal-fired everything and moving away from petrol in cars and all the sort of things that they're talking about and beginning to implement, specifically stopping the expansion of fossil fuels. And the problem is that if they don't do that and really look credible before the COP, then they're not going to be credible leaders at COP. And there's a risk that countries will say, well, you know, you're talking the right talk, but you're not actually doing anything. And so why should we? So we need to push our government to make really serious commitments before COP and then actually look as if they're doing something with them, because the implementation is the very, very key thing. And there was the recent Climate Change Committee report just a week or two ago, and they used they didn't mince words. They used phrases like, we've got to have a step change in the way the government is operating. There are gaps and ambiguities in what the government is saying, and we, the UK, continue to blunder into high carbon choices. And then they talk about climate contradictions, which I think you can interpret as disharmonies. And recently there's the proposal for a new coal mine in Cumbria, new oil field being considered near Shetland. You know, all these sort of things don't quite work in terms of harmony of approach and credibility. So next slide, please. And one of the really, really big issues around all this is the money problem. And it's going to be a problem anyway, because if we're shifting to a green economy globally, then we need to invest. But the longer we put off the investment, the more it's going to cost. So for that reason, we have to get on with it. But the money problem is actually far more serious for the lower income countries, where, for instance, you've got they've got to deal with COVID and the climate emergency, and often many of them are having to choose, do we spend the money on COVID response, or do we spend it on the longer term and immediate climate response? And this is where fairness and justice come in. Why should they have to choose? And it goes back to this historic, we're the ones who've basically caused the problem. They're the ones who are being really hammered by it. We, the rich countries, are failing to keep our promises and make appropriate commitments. In 2009, rich countries, the G7, promised $100 billion a year for climate response. Even now, 11 years later, 12 years later, we're only at 80 billion a year, and that's not on. And then there's a whole thing about debt and the fact that many low-income countries are struggling to pay debt which they owe governments and banks and financial institutions, and they feel they have to prioritize that over spending money on their own populations. And so that's a really big issue. If debt was cancelled, it would free up an awful lot of money to help countries do the right thing by their citizens. And just one statistic, and then I'll move to the next slide, but African countries between them are spending 3 times more on debt servicing, debt repayments, than it would cost to vaccinate the whole of Africa. And then that's serious. Before COVID, Ghana was paying 4 times more on debt payments than it was on health. And these are choices that countries should never ever have to make. So that's a campaign that Christian Aid are waging at the minute as well, to encourage banks and financial institutions to waive the debt or cancel the debt. Next slide, please. And to solve the money problem, again, it's the responsibility of rich countries like the UK. Two ways of doing this. First of all, just giving more money, directing it to green options, green opportunities. The photo on the left is from Honduras, a project that we've been supporting, which the climate changes there have made the traditional livelihoods very difficult. And so one of the ways we've been supporting communities is training women particularly to produce and market and install renewable energy. So here's solar panels on roofs. So that has all sorts of transformational impacts on communities, on the women themselves, as well as for the climate. And the other slide is from a recent campaign action that we did in the city, targeting some of the big banks who have been doing very well out of the pandemic, during the pandemic, but are still refusing to waive the debt servicing that some of these poorer countries are having to provide. So there's big campaign, big movement there, and the need for debt cancellation has in fact never been greater. Next slide, please. And this is a brilliant, this is where we're beginning to get into how can each of us engage in different ways. This is the Young Christian Climate Network, and it's a relay. Some of you may well have come across it. They decided that as young Christians, they really had to get together and do something about the climate emergency. So what they're doing, and Christian Aid is absolutely behind them on this, is to arrange a relay walk of about 1,200 miles from where the G7 was in Cornwall right the way up to Glasgow, arriving in Glasgow just before the COP starts, stopping off at a number of these major cities, and along the way having events and services and vigils and meeting MPs and so on, and really raising awareness and saying, actually, this matters so much that we're prepared to walk this route. And everybody, people of all ages are very welcome to join sections of the route for a day or 2 or 3 days, however long. There are other ways of supporting in terms of the it's coming to the events, coming to the services, talking to your MP before they reach your particular area, getting MPs excited and energized about all of this, even providing accommodation for some of the walkers, and of course underpinning all of it, praying. And there's much more detail on the website, but this is something that is really, really important and exciting. And it's another example of young people just grasping the nettle and getting on and doing stuff, and you know, so setting a really good example to the rest of us. So that's the relay. And then there are other things that all of us can do. And I'm aware that probably everybody who's in this gathering has been doing things in their own lives to help reduce carbon emissions. So recycling, you know, making sure you've got the right sort of light bulbs, using your car less, using public transport more, not using single-use plastics, you know, the full range. All of that is absolutely brilliant and really important, but we need a step change, as the Climate Committee indicated, to challenge at a national level and at an international level, and really go global on the level of influence that we're contributing to. And that's not actually as scary as it sounds. And there are all sorts of ways, and these you can find on our website. We can provide the links later, but there's a petition to Boris Johnson. There's just listing exactly what we would like him to do. There's a prayer pledge where you can pledge to pray about the climate crisis, pray for the decisions that are made at the COP, pray for the relay. And then there's a lovely idea of making a prayer boat where you write a prayer on a piece of paper and then turn it into a boat. And there are, I tried it last night and it did work. And then you can use that in your own prayers. You can do it collectively as a church. There is an opportunity to send it so that there's a whole display of prayer boats in Glasgow for the COP. You can talk to your MP and explain to her or him that this actually is so important and they've really got to get to grips with it. There are lots of worship and discussion resources to get your churches and friendship groups and social groups and so on really engaging with some of the issues. You could ask your church to declare a climate emergency, and some churches, denominations, dioceses have already done that. There's a brilliant full-length film that some of you might have seen called Thank You for the Rain, and you could show that at your church or other group and then have a really good discussion about it. It's about a farmer in Kenya and how his family have been impacted by the climate crisis and what they are doing about it. So it's actually really good to see that they're not just, as many people over here think, people are just sort of sitting around going floppy and saying, oh dear, we are victims of the climate crisis. But this film shows that there's a lot going on in the countries themselves, which we can engage with, support, and enhance, but it's their initiatives. And then finally, I mentioned the campaign for debt cancellation, which really has to be a major push. So that's broadly things to do. And overall, this is all about building momentum, putting pressure on the politicians. And it was great that in the feedback from the breakout groups this morning, somebody did talk about how do you influence the politicians and businesses who really can make a difference. This is how, and it'd be fantastic if together and in your different contexts we can get on and do it, because there's still time and we still need the harmony. Thank you. So back to
Great. So thank you very much, Jenny, for that, for inspiring us and showing us all of the different actions that we can take to get involved. We're now going to break into our breakout rooms. And the question in red is what I would like you all to discuss. So we've thought about the different ways that each of us can get involved, but if you're anything like me, oftentimes I hear these really great talks and I'm fired up and ready to go, but I don't think about the challenges that may lie ahead of me to actually, execute the actions that I feel drawn to. So I just want you to, in small groups, think about the specific things that might make it difficult for you to engage in the actions that you feel drawn to. So, for example, I love singing, worshiping with people, and so the example about creating sort of a worship event, maybe where you're praying with people, that fills me with excitement, but it also requires some kind of logistical planning, which I'm not as great at, if I'm honest. And so I think it'd be good just in these groups to talk about what might make things difficult for you to execute some of the actions, and specifically how can you overcome those challenges. So if you have something that you think is going to be challenging, there might be people in your group who have a solution for you to help you plan ahead. And we'll give that about 10 or so minutes, and then we'll come back into the plenary space, and I'll wrap us up before sending us off for a short break and then into the next session. So Matthew, if you could